So you're here to learn some more things about the book of Job. Is that right? So what would you like to learn? Everything is above my pay grade, but I'll do my best. Questions about
in the title is a good one, because this is not a book about the Jew. It's not about the relation of the Jews with their God. It's what the whole Testament is supposed to be about. So what the heck is it doing in our Bible?
Right. Walter is quite right. The book of Job is not about a Jew. The book of Job does not present the character Job or his friends, you're right, as Jews. Job is given to us as a man from the land of Uz, which is probably, Uz, we don't know where Uz is probably someplace in the East. The East in that cultural world was considered the source of wisdom, or people from the East were considerably wise and so forth. And you're right. There's nothing in the book about the things that you find normative in other parts of the Old Testament. For example, Moses, nothing. Covenant, nothing. Sinai, nothing. But that's not completely strange in this portion of the Hebrew Bible, which is not the same thing as the Old Testament. What? Footnote. Old Testament has a certain arrangement of books. Those same books are found in the Hebrew Bible, but in a different arrangement. In that arrangement in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Job is with other books that are like this. They're stepping back from the normal discourse or the prevailing discourse in the Old Testament. Discourse, and you'll see this today, discourse about how God interacts with the world and how God interacts specifically in the world through Israel and that covenant. Nothing about that, but these parts, that part of the Hebrew Bible where Job is found, not uncharacteristically steps back and kind of ponders this. And you'll see this play out in today's session. What else would you like to know about the book of Job?
Where is Uz?
Yeah, Uz, the land of Uz. Not really sure. It's probably someplace to the east of Palestine or Israel. Yeah. So let's get cracking with a few items about the book of Job. So this is a copy of Leningradensis. This is one of the earliest manuscripts that we have of Job, besides the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so the book of Job is written in Hebrew. And Walter, I appreciate your question, because most of the things are going to spin out of that. It's not the same Hebrew that we find elsewhere in the Old Testament. It's a very sophisticated Hebrew. What's sophisticated about it is not so much the grammar, although, as you'll see in a few minutes, in some places the grammar is just deliciously ambiguous, which is not accidental. The Hebrew is peculiar in its vocabulary. There are so many books or words in the book of Job that don't appear anywhere else, which, if you have any experience with formal translation projects, if we're translating a book where we're not really sure about a lot of the words because we don't have them occurring anywhere else, which that means we're guessing. So your English translations, or your French or Polish or whatever, Spanish, they're guesses, but they're informed guesses. So the book of Job is intriguing on every score. Here's another one. It was not written at a time that we can identify. We don't know when this book was written. It portrays characters, for example, as we said, without reference to any other thing going on in the Old Testament. So some people will say that's because the story took place very early in the Old Testament, before there was Moses, before there was Sinai, before there was the covenant. And so sometimes you'll hear people say it's the oldest book in the Bible, but that doesn't square with the Hebrew, as I just said. The Hebrew reflects Aramaisms. Aramaisms are not from early parts of the Old Testament. They're from later parts of the Old Testament. Other peculiarities of the language suggest that it's actually quite late. And that would, by the way, be in keeping with those other books of the Bible that I spoke about. They're typically later in the Old Testament period. And by the way, once you say date written unknown, it's pretty sure that author is unknown. And again, we don't know who wrote the book of Job. So in that sense, the book of Job is an anonymous book written by anonymous. Okay. Which, by the way, is quite like most of the other books in the Old Testament as well. For example, who wrote the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel? Don't know. That makes it anonymous. Who wrote the book of Ruth? Don't know. That makes it anonymous. So in that sense, we're in familiar territory here. And its motif is widely known. And this gives us something of an entree to the book of Job for our particular purposes. Are you still with me? Now, you'll notice what I'm doing with you right now. I'm just dunking you in a barrel of facts about the book of Job. This is a deliberate technique of mine because I find that if I do that, and if I dunk you enough sticks to you that we end up learning some things and we'll be better prepared for the rest of our series. Are you still game? Okay. So this motif that I just mentioned, we can call it the Joban motif, but not because it's unique to Job. On the contrary, it's just that Job is the most widely known example of this Joban motif. What is this Joban motif? Well, it first appears, or at least very early appears, in a Sumerian text from the 19th century BCE that we call A Man and His God. According to this very ancient text, Sumerian, you have a wise, upright person who had been prosperous and healthy. He's afflicted with severe, painful illness. He laments his condition. He pleads to his God for relief, acknowledging that he has sinned, as all humans do, and the God responds by driving away the sickness demon, and the man is restored. There's your Joban motif. A righteous man is afflicted, makes some kind of appeal or reference to God or pondering about God or the gods, and is restored. There's your Joban motif. And this is, whenever you date the book of Job, this is way before the book of Job was ever written. Okay, so it's a well-established literary and even theological motif. Here's another example, 1575 BC, in Akkadian text, a man implores his God on behalf of a friend who's suffering without cause. Note that phrase, without cause, suffering without cause. We'll come back to that. The deity acknowledges that the friend is indeed innocent of wrongdoing and assures restoration. So there's another text. Now notice with this example, there has been drawn into connection the experience of suffering and the relation of the divine to that. That's also woven into this thing we're calling the Joban motif. Here's another example. A later text about 1000 BCE, an Akkadian text, I will praise the Lord of wisdom. I don't think I need to go over the details. You know what to expect. A man of a high reputation, great piety, is suddenly and unexpectedly suffers multiple misfortunes, goes through pretty much what we see Job go through in the book of Job. He's dismayed over these things. No cause for his misery is evident in his behavior. You see that connection between behavior and one's fate? That's going to be huge. Joban motif. So he searches for a cure through divination. After about a year, he has a dream. Marduk, his god, sends messengers, and he is restored, and he praises Marduk. By the way, this is a widespread motif we find even in India in the early Christian era. The story of Hariskandra, basically the same thing. Now, you'll love this. In this old Indian story, among the deities, there is an assembly of the gods. There's a discussion as to whether there is on earth a man of perfect righteousness. They debate, they say no, some gods say there's no such thing, others say no, there's such a thing, we could find some such person and so forth. So they nominate King Hariskandra for a test, and they test him with calamities like Job's. Hariskandra maintains his integrity and his piety, and he's restored and rewarded. There's a pristine or almost complete example of the Joban motif. So are you dialed in now to the Joban motif? Long before the book of Job, whoever wrote it and whenever it was written, that the motif was well known. So it stands to reason that what we have in the book of Job is a biblical riff, a biblical spin, a biblical take on the well-known Joban motif. Okay. Again, not unusual in the Bible to do this, but that's another series of sessions we might do someday. So what are we going to do in this series? We're going to be looking at the book of Job, God willing, in 3 segments. Today, week 1, the prose prologue, the story of Job's test. I'll be unfolding much of this in today's session. Next week, if you decide to come back, poetic speeches, the story of God's test. So notice we move from the story of Job's test to the story of God's test. I've got to justify that. And then if you still are game, by the third week, we'll come back and look at the prose epilogue, Job's life after his test at the very end. Now, one of the standouts of the book of Job compositionally is that it is constructed of a prose prologue. It just reads like regular Hebrew narrative. And then the bulk of the book, from about chapter 211 to chapter 42, is in poetry. As I said, quite good poetry, and it's in standard Hebrew poetic form, although it's in exotic Hebrew language. Then, after the story of God's test is concerned, and by the way, this is when the friends show up, and this is when they're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And if you're intrigued by that, you'll have to come back next week. After they expend themselves talking, then the prose epilogue, you might say the prose returns, and we look at Job's life after his test. I need to be transparent with you. You're going to be getting here, well, actually in all of these, and particularly the third week, I just need to let you know that you're going to be getting some challenging material for two reasons. Number one, the material itself in the Bible is challenging. These are some of the most contested passages of Scripture among scholars, and I hope to give you a sense of why that's the case. But secondly, you're going to be getting some of my own interpretation. So you need to take that with a grain of salt. It's because it would be disingenuous for me to do anything else. Shall we proceed? Okay, you have a handout. So I'd like for you to take a look at that handout real quickly. I have a handout because I'm talking about the Bible and I'm an Episcopalian church. An Episcopal church, I can't count on Bibles being in every seat or in everybody's hand. So without any offense, I just want to refresh our memories about what's going on in the book of Job. So real quick, top to bottom, there was a man in the land of Uz, his name is Job. He's blameless. The narrator tells us he's blameless and one who feared God and turned away from evil. And so, now the word I just said, and so, is proper to the Hebrew, but it's not reflected in the English. So let's do that again, verse 1 and verse 2. There once was a man, a land of Uz, named Job. He's perfect, he's upright, fears God, turned from evil. And so there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. Now you must understand, in the ancient world, having 7 sons and 3 daughters is a mark of prominence and blessing and favor. By the way, to be fair, at the end of the book, the daughters get their due in an unusual way. And so, between verse 1 and verse 2 suggests a causal connection between his piety, verse 1, and his circumstances of wealth and blessing, verse 2. And though verse 3, we elaborate on his wealth and his prestige. Verse 4, his sons would go on feasts and his daughters as well. They would celebrate. And Job, verse 5, would take extra care with his own offerings to God to cover any kind of transgressions his children might have made inadvertently. You're getting a sense of the extraordinary degree of his piety. This is a genuinely and thoroughly devotional man. Verse 6, one day the heavenly beings, B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, in the Hebrew, became to present themselves before the Lord, and the Satan also came among them. Often translated in Bibles, Satan. We'll come back to that in a few moments, God willing. And so you have this conversation between the Lord and the Satan. The Lord in verse 7 says, what have you been doing? The Satan says, I've been going to and fro, looking around. And the Lord says, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on earth, blameless, upright man who fears God, turns away from evil. Then the Satan said, or the Satan said, does he do this for nothing? I'm going to be unpacking some of these verses more thoroughly. I just want to make sure they're downloaded in our minds right now. Verse 10, this is the Satan or the Satan speaking to God. Haven't you put a fence around him and his house, that all he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased. But stretch out your hand now and touch all he has. He will curse you to your face. This is a matter of, will Job maintain his integrity, his piety, his devotion to God, if God takes away all the things that Job enjoys from God's hand? Verse 11. The Lord said to the Satan, okay, everything, all that he has is in your power. Don't stretch out your hand against him personally. So the Satan went out. And now I'm fast forwarding You have three messengers suddenly arrive, one right after the other, right after the other. Literally, it goes like this. And a messenger came to Job and told him about this calamity. And no sooner had that servant stopped speaking, and another servant arrived and told Job about more calamities. And no sooner had that servant stopped speaking than another messenger. You see the style there. This is a narrative technique. It's beautifully written, obviously, to just compound and intensify the rapidity and the impact of these disasters that come upon Job. He loses his children. He loses all of his wealth. He loses his standing in the community. And Job mourns in worship. We'll look at that closely in a moment. He says, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return there. The Lord gives, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. This is a picture of a man maintaining his integrity, you see, in the face of calamity. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. We'll come back to that in a moment. Then you go to the next chapter, and you probably know it's a repeat. The sons of God, God speaks to the Satan. Have you considered my servant Job? And the Satan raises the stakes, saying, well, yeah, but if you touch a person's physical health, that's the acid test. Then Job will curse you to your face, the Satan says to God. God says, okay, but don't kill him. And so Satan goes off and does this. Job is afflicted head to toe, and he maintains his integrity nonetheless. We'll be unpacking some of that. So there's your basic story. Job is doubly afflicted. Let's just take a look at the general impression people tend to get. We have, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return her. This is the patron saint of patience. Okay, Job the patient. This is our standard motif. People who don't know anything about the book of Job, this is what they get. If you stay tuned to our series, you'll find out that this is hardly an accurate representation of Job. He may be patient, but he's not always kind, especially in his thoughts about God. That's coming up later. Walter, did you have a question?
I'm just curious that blessed be the name of the Lord. Is that the same blessed be the name of the Lord that you see over and over in the Hebrew Bible?
That's right.
So this tells us that this is not like a translation of some other text. This is a Hebrew author maybe doing his riff on.
Absolutely, which is another argument for a later composition chronologically. Book of Job seems to be engaging with certain parts of the Bible without representing the story as taking place in those earlier parts. There's a place, we might look at it next week, where Psalm 8, out of the mouth of babes, what is man that you are mindful of him? This is Psalm 8. There's a portion in the book of Job where Job parodies that. It's just like, what is man that you pay such close attention to him, God? You don't even give me a chance to spit without choking on it. There's a deliberate, you're quite right, a deliberate play on a revered piece of scripture elsewhere in the Bible, the Psalms. Baruch Shem Adonai, but blessed be the name of the Lord is another example of that, quite right. Yeah, and we'll see that nuanced as we proceed. There's another place. After Job is physically afflicted, so he's really stripped of everything. His wife says, why do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die. God has done this to you. Why don't you do the real thing of integrity, Job, she says, would be to curse God, since God has done this to you. But it says, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. What a strange thing to say, did not sin with his lips. If what's being stated here is Job did not err or vary or change in his theology, in his speaking about God, that is theology. Okay? And all this, he did not sin in his theology, which signals that the book of Job is going to be about, among other things, a theme of the book of Job is theology, speaking about God in a variety of circumstances. So far, so good? You're still with me? Okay. So this is, by philosophers, this thing about speaking about God in the face of calamity is often parsed with this particular model. We can say, theology, God is all good. That is to say, all the things God does are good. Another theological statement is God is all powerful. There is nothing outside God's control and God's power and God's management. And then there is the fact of innocent suffering. And the problem becomes relating these three. If we say that God is all good, everything under God's management is good, then why is there innocent suffering? Because that's not good. If we say that God is all powerful, then we have to say God is the reason that there is innocent suffering, and that makes it very difficult to affirm that. So the problem is how to affirm all three. If we say God is all good and there is innocent suffering, how can we also say God is all powerful? You see the problem? Now, the book of Job treats various themes, but this is at least one of them that it treats. Interestingly, the book of Job treats this, or at least frames it with, as I mentioned before, a delicious bit of ambiguity. Here's one of them. You saw the words of Job. He says, "Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" This is when his wife challenged him. Job, curse God and die. And he says, actually, here's what he says. Okay, now I just read that. This is the translation. This is one translation. But if I read these same words in the following intonation, I'm not trying to show off here, this is to show you the ambiguity. Gam et hatov nikabel me'et ha'elohim ve'et ha'ra lo nikabel? Did you hear the different way I just read those same words? In one, I just made it just now I made it a question. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? Here, if this is the proper translation of this ambiguous phrase, then Job is not affirming this. He's affirming, he's not affirming this. I would correct myself. God is all powerful, and we can receive bad just as much as we receive good. And so Job is soft pedaling on this in order to affirm this. However, the same phrase can be read as a statement and not a question. It is only good that we receive from God and not evil. So here Job is saying, God is all good. Whatever I am experiencing is not from an all-powerful God. It's from some other source. Okay? So it's wonderfully ambiguous. Okay, and trust me, in this book, nothing is accidental in its composition. Okay. So the narrator is presenting to us, you see, in a very wonderfully nuanced, ambiguous form, the nature of the question. How do we speak about God in the face of innocent suffering? This is elaborated wonderfully in a play on words. So not just ambiguity of the Hebrew formulation, question or statement, but also in the Hebrew words. For example, there once was a man named Job, you know this, who was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. That's the very first verse. Then we read 3 verses later, God is speaking to the Satan. Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. So here we have a double affirmation. The narrator tells you Job is righteous. God endorses that judgment or that evaluation of Job. He's perfect, he's upright, he fears God, he turns from evil. And then lastly, when we get to chapter 2, the repeat, you might say, test 2. Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on earth, blameless and upright man who turns away from evil. So here we have evil. Turns away from evil, turns away from evil, turns away from evil. Now, in English as well as, especially in Hebrew, this comes out strong, this presence of the word evil. So then we have the Satan from the presence of, I'm going to show you the ambiguity, the play on those words in just a second. So the Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with evil sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And Job, he replies to his wife. His reply is about God as the source of evil as well as good. You know this. Okay. But once again, notice here, Job is struck with evil sores from the sole of his foot. That's a peculiar way of saying he's got shechin, sores on his foot, sores on his leg. Shechin, ra. Ra is a deliberate word. It's the same word. He turns from evil. He turns from ra. So now he has Ra on his physical. So here we see a very interesting connection in the two meanings of the word evil in Hebrew, and this is frequent throughout the Hebrew Bible. The same word can refer to circumstantial catastrophe. Evil has befallen me. Okay, circumstantial catastrophe. The same word, similar to English, evil, can denote a moral failure, moral behavior. He's an evil man. We use the same word to describe a calamity of circumstances or a moral quality, and that's exactly what's going on here. So Satan articulates the question which will occupy the rest of the story. How are we to understand the relationship between avoiding evil and experiencing evil? Now, do you see the two meanings of the words? How do we account for, how do we make intelligible the relationship between avoiding evil, moral, and experiencing evil, circumstance? And this is a universal question, by the way. If you think you smell the Joban motif, yes, this is the Joban motif articulated in a particular way. Are you tracking with me? So, beautifully in its literary composition, the book of Job is making known to the reader, dear reader, this is what this book is about. But it's more than just this. This is an interesting, fascinating question that has occupied human cultures throughout history. But human cultures, as they consider this question, also weave in the factor that is not shown here, and that is the factor of God, the factor of the divine. What is the relationship of the divine to the experience of circumstantial evil and its relationship to personal behavior? The book of Job is structured to deal with this at great length. This view, a certain view, is expressed classically in Proverbs 19:23, and it goes like this: He who fears the Lord, Job fears the Lord. Remember, that's said twice. Earns life. He shall abide in contentment, free from the experience of Ra, free from the experience of circumstantial catastrophe or disaster. That's a bold statement. That's a bold statement, and that's a representative statement from the book of Proverbs writ large. Okay, the book of Proverbs affirms this basic principle. What's the principle? You do good, you get good. You do bad, you get bad. There's an act-consequence dynamic that is assumed in the book of Proverbs and affirmed in the book of Proverbs over and over and over. So the Satan is simply a character in the story to force this question. What question? Is it true? I love it when I teach, God bless them, Christian undergraduate students, okay, who've been raised, and they should be raised, to affirm that if you do good, you get good, and if you do bad, you get bad. So we review that question, and then I just ask them the most obvious question. I ask them, in your experience of life, is that true? And I got to tell you, in many cases, this is the first time anybody's ever asked them that question. Because they go, well, yeah, no, yeah, it has to be true because it's in the Bible. But it's not true in my experience. Welcome to adulthood. So what's up with the Satan? Why don't you call him Satan? Because Satan is a mistranslation. The word that we call Satan in English is spelled the normal way here in Hebrew in the book of Job. But there's a particular way of characterizing, when I say characterizing, of formulating it. It's not Satan, which would be a proper noun, a name. It's Ha-Satan, which is a position, a title, a role, a function. Ha-Satan, the Satan, is evidently from other parts of the Old Testament, a figure in a royal governing court whose job is to go around and just make sure everybody is in line with the regime's policies. This was a a functionary of the Persian Empire, for example, people would be going about just paid by the government to kind of listen in and make sure everybody is compliant and towing the line and so forth, and keeps the emperor informed. Now, I'm not suggesting this is a direct explanation of what we have going on in Job, but we do have this. Evidently, we have a character among the sons of God that were gathering and talking with God, and God turns to one of them, apparently called known as Hasatan, the Satan, and says, "Have you checked out Job?" All of that is very interesting, but I submit to you, irrelevant. Why? Because if we just look at what it is this character does, this character, Hasatan, simply articulates the question twice: does a man serve God for nothing, chinam? And then that character, the Satan, disappears from the story forever. So clearly, the Satan has a role here, the Satan has a role here that is not suggested to be something we take as a depiction of an actual creature in the actual divine council. I submit to you, we have a literary device here. He's a character who articulates the key question: what is the connection between a man's wealth, a woman's prestige, a person's success from the hand of God on the one hand, and that person's piety and devotion to God? If you take away the one, will they still affirm the other? If you take away the blessings, will they still affirm God, who's no longer blessing them? The Satan verbalizes the question that the book will treat, and the figure Satan disappears entirely. I suggest to you, it's nothing more than that. We have a literary device by a masterful literary artist. So we continue. Week 1, prose prologue, the story of Job's test, maintains, this is the question, and this is the Satan's question. Can a human maintain integrity in the face of calamity? Okay. In other words, is a person's piety a true piety, or is it contingent upon circumstances? A fair weather believer, so to speak. In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Answer, yes. Can a person maintain integrity? The storyteller of the book of Job imagines a scenario where, I can imagine such a person doing that. Doing this, Job did not sin with his lips. So we have to consider, was this due to his radical monotheism? Radical monotheism. This is something I would like for us to consider. And you know exactly where I got this. Radical monotheism is a stance that evidently Job seems to take, and that is to say, I am going, good or bad, I'm going to receive everything that happens to me as from the hand of God and from no other determinate metaphysical force. There is no other force. There is no other authority over me. There is no other God. Hear the monotheism? There is no other God than this God, and whatever comes my way, I accept from the hand of this God. That is one way of expressing what I'm calling, what has been called radical monotheism. Good? How does that work? Well, we can consider this. And let me go back then. Let me explain radical monotheism. Job here would be saying, there is only one divine authority over me, God. So when evil comes my way, and there he is just covered with sores, he's penniless, he's childless, this puts me to the test. I don't know that I could affirm with Job, blessed be the name of the Lord, if I lost my children. I don't know. And God forbid I should ever be put in that situation. The storyteller imagines it for us and affirms, yes, it can be done. Do you understand what the radical monotheism is? However, this form of radical monotheism denies that God is all good. And that's a challenge, given the full testimony of Scripture and even some other things in the book of Job. So we need to ask, is this story true? Okay. And the answer is no. Why do I say that? I think I've got your interest now for a few more minutes. We're almost done. The answer is no, the story is not true. The dialogue in heaven, think about this. Okay? You've got a camera on Job, verse 1, verse 2. He's blessed. He's doing these offerings for his children. He's carrying out his life. Then the camera switches to some place where you've got the sons of God, and you've got God, and you've got the Satan, and they're talking everything. So who is there to record that conversation? Great question, and we're never going to answer it, but it does suggest, you see, that the story is not literally, historically true. The stylized narration in several places, but remember I told you about how the messengers come to Job, just literally like they're timed, with a stopwatch, like this has been rehearsed. That kind of stylization of the rapid sequence events is, by the way, something like the Gospel of Mark, boom, 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 which is a literary contrivance because Jesus could not possibly, nobody can live that kind of a life nonstop. So, nonstop. The stylized narration tells us this is not a videotape recording. This is not a recording of something that actually happened. It's not true. The Joban motif. These other Sumerian, Akkadian, other sources talking about a man suffering and wondering what's going on with my God and so forth, those are not ever taken as historically true. So the Joban motif that generates the book of Job suggests it too is not true. And Job, by the way, is clearly every man. What do I mean? I think you're already there. Every man. Job represents the human being. What human being? Yes, all human beings who find themselves in this situation of weighing devotion to God and the experience of life. Is devotion of God justified when God treats you so badly? And what is the nature of one's integrity? That's every person's question. And by the way, I have found an experience that this is trans-class. All people, however well they can conceptualize it and verbalize it, all adults come to wrestle with this in one form or another, and that's what I mean by every man. So is the story of Job true? No. Yes, it is true. It is true. Because Job is every man. That's a sign of a very true story. Well, we're no longer talking about historically true, are we? We're talking about existentially true. As universally true as can be imagined because it does not have to be imagined. I would submit to you that Job is, in some ways, more true the way it was written than it would be if it was simply a recording of something that happened. Because the recording of something that happened is nothing but a record. But the book of Job is a deep reflection and brings forth a truth far more penetrating to us and far more relevant to us than just a video recording of what happened to this guy one day in his life. Do you follow my reasoning? So is it true? Not if you're looking for a certain type of truth, like historically accurate. But if you're open to a far more relevant truth, I would suggest biblical truth. It's, I would say, one of the most true writings you'll ever come across. So on that basis, we will continue, having proceeded with week one, the story of Job's test. Can a human maintain integrity in the face of calamity? Okay. Next week, poetic speeches, the story of God's test. Because God's test will pose a flip question. We've answered the question, can a human maintain integrity in the face of calamity? And by the way, it's not just Job. This world right now is filled with people who have maintained their integrity in the face of horrifying calamity. It's true. So let's switch the question. Can God maintain integrity in the face of calamity? Job was able to do that by simply denying God's goodness in favor of God's power. Shall we receive only good and not bad? So that's one answer Job gives at this point in the story to the question, can God maintain integrity? As we continue, we'll see that Job begins to reconsider his answer, and it gets more and more intriguing, I promise you. So God to the Satan, my servant Job still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. Out of God's own mouth, an acknowledgement that there is no connection between his circumstances and his piety. For no reason, I afflicted him at your suggestion. Again, this is literary. It's not as though God was approached by the Satan. It's a way of framing the question because the experience is, and this is going to be the driving question for the next 40 chapters, is this true? For no reason, chinam. By the way, it's the same phrase that the Satan used at first. Does Job serve you chinam, for no reason? And God says, I've afflicted him for no reason, which puts it to a strong test. As we'll see next week, and we close with this, the friends will come along and they will propose a frame by which Job's experience and God's relationship to it can be made intelligible. And Job will seriously consider that question. So I hope you return. Thank you. We're good for now.